It was a Tuesday when the aliens arrived, which really should have been everyone's first clue that this whole thing was going to go sideways. Nothing good ever happens on a Tuesday. Mondays you expect disaster. Wednesdays you're halfway to the weekend. But Tuesdays? Tuesdays are when the universe decides to mess with you just because it can. Commander Vexstar of the Galactic Council stepped off his shimmering transport ship with all the dramatic flair of a soap opera villain who'd been practicing his entrance in the mirror for 3 hours. Picture a 7-foot-tall cross between a rhinoceros and a tax auditor, wearing what appeared to be medieval armor made from discarded satellite dishes. His voice boomed across the hastily assembled greeting committee like someone had given Darth Vader a megaphone and a caffeine addiction. "Greetings, primitive humans of the Third Rock from your unremarkable yellow star," Vexstar announced, clearly having memorized this speech from some kind of Galactic Intimidation 101 handbook. "I am Commander Vexstar, voice of the mighty Galactic Council, keeper of 1,000 worlds, and winner of last year's Best Dramatic Entrance Award at the annual Cosmic Conference." Okay, I made up that last part, but honestly, it wouldn't have surprised anyone. The Earth Defense Committee, a group of officials who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the universe at that moment, shuffled nervously behind their makeshift podium. General Patricia Hawkins, a woman who'd seen 3 wars and 2 alien contact scenarios, stepped forward with the kind of resigned expression usually reserved for people about to deliver very bad news to very important people. "Welcome to Earth, Commander," she said, probably wondering if her government pension covered alien stress disorders. "What can we do for the Galactic Council?" Vexstar's chest puffed out so far it looked like he might achieve escape velocity. "Your species has been selected for the honor of participating in the legendary Trial of Doom." He paused dramatically, clearly expecting gasps of awe or possibly spontaneous applause. Instead, he got the sound of General Hawkins' aide frantically Googling Trial of Doom on his phone. "The what now?" General Hawkins asked, which wasn't exactly the reverent whisper Vexstar was probably hoping for. "The Trial of Doom," Vexstar repeated, this time with jazz hands. "An ancient rite of combat where each species sends forth their most dangerous, their most cunning, their most absolutely terrifying warrior to compete in challenges that would make lesser beings weep tears of pure terror." "Right," said General Hawkins slowly, the way people do when they're trying to figure out if the person talking to them is insane or just really, really dramatic. "And what happens if we don't participate?" Vexstar's expression shifted from dramatic enthusiasm to the kind of smile that sharks probably practice in front of mirrors. "Oh, but you will participate, humans. You see, every species that refuses the trial faces—" He paused again, clearly loving this part. "Immediate and total annihilation by the combined forces of the Galactic Council." Now, at this point, you might be wondering where all of Earth's legendary heroes were. Where were the Navy SEALs, the Special Forces, the martial arts masters, the people who do those impossible stunts in action movies? Well, funny story about that. They were all busy. You know, with actual wars, peacekeeping missions, training exercises, and generally being competent at their jobs somewhere else on the planet. Which brings us to Marvin Bookworth, who at that exact moment was walking up the steps of the Global Defense Headquarters, completely oblivious to the alien ultimatum happening inside. Marvin wasn't there for anything heroic or world-saving. He was there because the astronomy department at the nearby university had racked up about $200 in overdue fines on some star charts, and someone needed to sort out the paperwork. Marvin was 32, wore glasses that had been repaired with tape so many times they qualified as modern art, and possessed the kind of forgettable face that made him perfect for substitute librarian work. His greatest achievement to date was reorganizing the university's entire science fiction collection, using a filing system so logical that it actually made grown men weep with joy. He pushed through the doors of the defense headquarters just as Vexstar was reaching the climax of his ultimatum speech. Something about cosmic glory and the honor of your pathetic species. Marvin, being a polite person, waited quietly by the door with his folder of overdue book notices, assuming this was some kind of military ceremony he shouldn't interrupt. "So," Vexstar boomed, spreading his arms wide, "who among you will be humanity's champion? Who possesses the courage, the strength, the sheer, deadly competence to represent your world in the Trial of Doom?" The room fell silent. Everyone looked at everyone else. General Hawkins opened her mouth, probably to explain that they needed to make some phone calls and maybe draft a few people, when her aide leaned over and whispered something that made her face go very pale, very quickly. "Ma'am," the aide whispered, Our best people are deployed in 17 different countries. The earliest we could recall anyone is 3 weeks. 3 weeks, General Hawkins hissed back. What about the local bases? Training exercise in Alaska. Won't be back for a month. It was at this moment that everyone in the room became acutely aware of the only other person present, a mild-mannered man in a brown cardigan, holding a folder and looking like he was waiting for someone to tell him where the office supply closet was. Marvin, noticing the sudden attention, raised his hand politely. Excuse me, but I'm just here about some overdue astronomy books. Should I come back later? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how Marvin Bookworth, substitute librarian and part-time crossword puzzle enthusiast, accidentally volunteered to save humanity from total annihilation. Sometimes the universe has a really twisted sense of humor. Now, let's talk about Marvin Bookworth, because if you're going to put your faith in someone to save the entire human race, you should probably know their qualifications. Spoiler alert, they weren't impressive. Marvin had been a substitute librarian for 8 years, which in library terms made him basically a Swiss Army knife of mild competence. Need someone to explain the difference between the biography and autobiography sections? Marvin was your guy. Printer jamming and making sounds like a dying walrus? Marvin had wrestled worse machines than that, and lived to tell the tale. Usually very boring tales, but tales nonetheless. His most heroic moment to date had been surviving a 3-hour budget meeting where the head librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had argued passionately about whether they could afford new "Quiet Please" signs. Marvin had not only stayed awake through the entire ordeal, he'd actually taken notes. In perfect handwriting, with bullet points. If that doesn't scream Galactic champion material, I don't know what does. The thing about Marvin was that he approached everything with the kind of methodical precision that made him absolutely perfect for library work, and absolutely terrible for anything requiring quick reflexes or, not dying horribly. He owned exactly 3 pairs of pants, all brown. His idea of a wild Friday night was reorganizing his personal book collection by publication date instead of by author. He had never been in a fight, unless you counted the great library card dispute of 2019, which had mostly involved very stern email exchanges. But here's where things got interesting, in that cosmic joke kind of way. While General Hawkins was frantically whispering with her aides about options and alternatives, and maybe we could ask Canada if they have anyone available, Marvin was standing there with the patience of someone who'd spent years waiting for people to return books that were just slightly overdue. Commander Vextar, meanwhile, was studying this unremarkable human with the kind of intensity usually reserved for bomb disposal experts examining suspicious packages. In his experience, when a species was faced with total annihilation, they usually sent forth their most terrifying warrior immediately. The fact that these humans were just standing there, calmly presenting him with what appeared to be their chosen champion, was unsettling. "This is your warrior?" Vextar asked, gesturing at Marvin with one of his massive clawed appendages. General Hawkins looked at Marvin, then at the alien commander, then back at Marvin, clearly calculating whether it was more embarrassing to admit they had no one else available or to pretend this had been the plan all along. Being a military officer who'd learned that confidence could sometimes substitute for competence, she chose option 2. "This is Marvin Bookworth," she announced with the kind of authority that suggested she definitely knew what she was doing and wasn't making it up as she went along. "He's one of our most specialized operatives." Marvin blinked. "I'm sorry, what now?" "Specialized in what manner?" Vextar demanded, leaning forward with obvious interest. General Hawkins looked at Marvin's folder of overdue notices, then at his carefully prepared glasses, then at his cardigan, which had a small hole near the left elbow where he'd caught it on a filing cabinet. "Information warfare," she said, because technically, librarians did deal with information. "And psychological operation." "Psychological operations?" Marvin repeated, sounding like someone who'd just been told he was fluent in a language he'd never heard of. "Oh yes," General Hawkins continued, warming to her theme. "Marvin here has spent years infiltrating academic institutions, gaining access to classified knowledge, and mastering the art of strategic patience." Vextar's eyes narrowed. In his culture, strategic patience was a feared technique used only by the most dangerous assassins. "Impressive," he rumbled. "And his combat training?" General Hawkins glanced at Marvin, who was looking increasingly confused. "Tell them about the printer incident, Marvin." "The printer incident?" Marvin asked. "Oh, you mean when the big copier on the 3rd floor got jammed with someone's thesis about medieval poetry, and I had to disassemble half the machine to get it working again? That took me 4 hours, and I had to use 3 different types of tools, and Mrs. Patterson said it was the most thorough mechanical problem-solving she'd ever seen. but I don't really see how that's... He trailed off as he noticed everyone staring at him. Vexter in particular looked deeply thoughtful, the way people do when they're trying to figure out if what they'd just heard was a confession of mechanical genius or a very detailed threat. 4 hours, Vexter murmured, to dismantle and reconstruct a complex mechanical device, using primitive tools, while remaining completely calm under pressure. He turned to General Hawkins. Your species chooses their champions well. We like to think so, General Hawkins replied, mentally adding buy lottery tickets to her to-do list, because clearly she was on some kind of incredible luck streak. The next hour was a blur of paperwork, which honestly was the first part of this whole experience that Marvin actually understood. There were forms to sign, waivers to initial, and a surprisingly detailed questionnaire about dietary restrictions and next of kin. Marvin filled everything out with the same careful attention to detail he brought to cataloging new acquisitions. His training, such as it was, consisted of someone handing him a book called Intergalactic Combat for Dummies and 45 minutes in a supply closet with a stapler, practicing what the book described as basic defensive movements. Marvin, being Marvin, actually read the entire book. He even took notes. They weren't very good notes, mostly things like, remember to duck, and apparently yelling is considered psychological warfare in some cultures, but they were organized notes. By the time Vexter announced it was time to depart for the Cosmic Coliseum, Marvin had accepted his fate with the kind of resigned determination that had gotten him through 8 years of substitute teaching. How hard could it be, really? He'd dealt with teenagers who hadn't returned books for 6 months. He'd survived budget meetings. He'd once spent an entire afternoon explaining to a PhD candidate why you couldn't check out the reference books. If that wasn't preparation for mortal combat, what was? Ready, Champion Bookworth? Vextar asked as they approached the alien transport ship. Marvin adjusted his glasses, clutched his folder of overdue notices and nodded. As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose. And with that inspiring battle cry, Earth's most unlikely hero stepped aboard an alien spacecraft, carrying nothing but a cardigan, a stapler, and the complete knowledge of the Dewey Decimal System. The universe was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword or a gun. Sometimes it's a really good filing system. The trip to the Cosmic Coliseum took exactly 4 hours, 17 minutes, and 32 seconds, which Marvin knew because he'd been keeping track in a small notebook he'd pulled from his cardigan pocket. Not because he was planning some kind of elaborate escape route or timing alien security protocols, mind you. He was just the kind of person who liked to know how long things took. It was the same compulsion that made him always return library books exactly on time and arrange his lunch in order of nutritional content. When the transport ship's doors opened and Marvin got his first look at the Cosmic Coliseum, his immediate thought was that whoever had designed this place had clearly never heard of proper safety regulations. The arena was basically a massive floating island in space, covered with what appeared to be every possible way to die horribly that the galaxy's architects could imagine. There were lava pits, spinning blade obstacles, gravity wells that bent light around them, and what looked suspiciously like a moat filled with something that glowed purple and made angry bubbling sounds. Impressive, is it not? Commander Vextar asked, clearly expecting Marvin to be overwhelmed by the majesty of it all. It's certainly something, Marvin replied, making a note in his notebook about what he was pretty sure was a violation of at least 14 different occupational safety codes. Is there a facilities manager I could speak with? Because I have some concerns about the accessibility compliance. Vextar stared at him for a long moment. You wish to critique the Cosmic Coliseum? Well, not critique exactly, Marvin said, adjusting his glasses. More like constructive feedback. I mean, where are the handrails? What about emergency exits? And don't get me started on the lighting situation. Half of these walkways are in complete shadow. Someone's going to trip and hurt themselves. This was apparently not the reaction Vextar had been expecting from humanity's champion. Most warriors who arrived at the Coliseum spent their time roaring challenges, flexing impressive muscles, or at least looking appropriately intimidated. They didn't usually offer to help improve the architectural planning. Champion Bookworth? Vexter said slowly. Perhaps you would like to meet your fellow competitors? Now, here's where things got really interesting. The other warriors gathered in the pre-competition staging area were exactly what you'd expect from a galaxy-wide tournament of doom. There was Gorthak the Bone Crusher, who looked like someone had crossed a grizzly bear with a bulldozer and then given the result anger management issues. His introduction consisted entirely of roaring and punching a metal wall hard enough to leave a dent shaped like his fist. Then there was Zephyra, the Mind Melter, a sleek purple alien with too many eyes and tentacles that moved independently of each other in ways that hurt to look at. She didn't say anything when they were introduced, just stared at Marvin with an intensity that suggested she was trying to read his thoughts. Marvin, being polite, stared back and wondered if she needed directions to something. The third competitor was Crocs the Unstoppable, who was basically a walking tank with the personality of a caffeinated rhinoceros. His pre-competition ritual involved lifting increasingly heavy objects and throwing them at walls while screaming what were probably battle cries in his native language, though they sounded more like someone gargling gravel. And then there was Marvin, who had found a chair in the corner and was quietly reading his Intergalactic Combat for Dummies book, while occasionally glancing up to observe his competition with the kind of detached interest he usually reserved for particularly difficult crossword puzzles. The other warriors kept stealing glances at him, and you could practically see the wheels turning in their alien brains. Here was this small, unremarkable human, sitting calmly in the middle of a room full of the galaxy's most dangerous killers, apparently completely unconcerned by the fact that he was about to participate in a trial that had a 67% fatality rate. Clearly this was some kind of psychological warfare. Gorthak the Bone Crusher, never one for subtlety, stomped over to Marvin's corner. "Human!" he bellowed in a voice like grinding stone. "I am Gorthak. I have crushed the bones of 1,000 enemies. I have bathed in the blood of warriors from 17 different solar systems. I have never known defeat." Marvin looked up from his book and blinked. "That's nice," he said pleasantly. "I'm Marvin. I reorganize things for a living." Gorthak's massive brow furrowed. "You reorganize things?" "Oh yes," Marvin said, warming to the topic. "Books, files, data systems, sometimes entire collections that haven't been properly cataloged in decades. It's quite satisfying, really. There's something deeply peaceful about taking chaos and turning it into order." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when someone says something so completely unexpected that everyone's brain needs a moment to reboot. Gorthak looked like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of threat or just a really boring conversation. "You speak of bringing order to chaos?" Zephyra the Mind Melter asked, her voice like whispers in an empty library. "This is your combat philosophy?" "Well, I wouldn't call it a philosophy, exactly," Marvin replied, making a small notation in the margin of his book. "More like a practical approach to problem solving. I find that most difficulties can be resolved if you just take the time to understand the underlying organizational structure." Crocs the Unstoppable, who had been listening to this exchange while continuing to lift heavy objects, suddenly stopped mid-throw. "Understanding. Organizational structure," he repeated slowly. "To defeat enemies." "Oh, I don't really defeat anyone," Marvin said, looking genuinely confused. "I just help them find what they're looking for more efficiently." The three alien warriors exchanged looks. In their cultures, speaking cryptically about bringing order to chaos and helping enemies find what they're looking for sounded like the kind of thing legendary assassins said right before they did something incredibly violent and creative. The fact that this human was discussing it so casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, was deeply unsettling. "Tell me, human," Gorthak rumbled, leaning closer, "how many have you helped find what they were looking for?" Marvin thought for a moment. "Oh, thousands, I'd say. Maybe tens of thousands over the years. Students, mostly, though occasionally faculty members who'd lost track of their research materials." "Tens of thousands," Zephyr whispered, her tentacles writhing with what might have been respect or terror. "And they were all satisfied with what you helped them find?" Crocs asked. "Well, mostly," Marvin said. "Though there was this one graduate student who got very upset when I explained that the book she needed had been checked out by someone else 3 months ago, and she should have requested it earlier if her thesis deadline was that important. She cried a little bit, but I think that was more about poor time management than anything I did." The warriors fell silent again. The idea of making enemies weep through pure psychological manipulation was impressive enough. The fact that this human spoke about it so matter-of-factly, as if breaking people's spirits were just part of his daily routine, was genuinely frightening. As they were led to the arena's main staging area, Marvin got his first good look at the obstacles they'd be facing. There were spinning platforms suspended over pits of what appeared to be liquid fire. There were walls covered in spikes that moved in complex patterns. There were floating platforms that randomly disappeared and reappeared, and at the center of it all was a massive crystalline structure that pulsed with energy and made a low humming sound that you could feel in your bones. The trials will test your combat skills, your intelligence, your courage, and your ability to adapt to impossible circumstances, announced the Colosseum's AI system in a voice like processed thunder. Only one competitor will survive to claim victory. The rest will face elimination. Marvin raised his hand politely. Excuse me, but when you say elimination, do you mean actual death? Or more like disqualification? Death, the AI replied cheerfully. Ah, said Marvin, making another note in his book. That's what I thought, but I wanted to be sure. Do you happen to have the safety statistics for previous competitions? I'd be interested to see the injury reports. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how Marvin Bookworth became the first competitor in the history of the Trial of Doom to request actuarial data before the competition began. The universe was starting to realize it might have underestimated librarians. The first challenge was called the Maze of Infinite Knowledge, which sounded impressive until you realized it was basically a giant library that someone had designed while having a really bad fever dream. The maze consisted of towering shelves filled with books, scrolls, data crystals, and information storage devices from every corner of the galaxy, all arranged in what appeared to be completely random order. Somewhere in this chaos was hidden the key to the next challenge. Most competitors had the same basic strategy: smash things until something useful appeared. Gorthak began his approach by punching through entire shelves, roaring triumphantly every time ancient texts exploded into confetti. Zephyra used her psychic abilities to hurl entire sections of books across the maze, apparently hoping the key would fall out like a prize from a piñata. Croc simply charged forward in a straight line, destroying everything in his path with the kind of focused determination usually reserved for natural disasters. Marvin, meanwhile, stood at the entrance of the maze for exactly 37 seconds, took out his notebook, and began what could only be described as a preliminary assessment. Interesting, he murmured, jotting down observations. Galactic classification system appears to be based on crystalline storage density rather than subject matter. No apparent chronological organization. Cross-referencing seems to follow quantum probability matrices rather than traditional indexing. While the other competitors created increasingly impressive explosions in the distance, Marvin began walking through the maze at the kind of steady, methodical pace that had made him legendary among university students who needed to find extremely specific research materials 5 minutes before the library closed. He said to himself, pausing at a section where glowing scrolls were mixed randomly with what appeared to be fossilized data tablets. Whoever organized this clearly prioritized storage efficiency over retrieval accessibility. Very impractical for actual use. He began making small adjustments as he walked, nothing dramatic, just shifting a few items here and there, grouping similar materials together, creating small islands of logical order in the chaos. It was the kind of unconscious organizational behavior that all librarians developed after years of seeing things in the wrong places. What Marvin didn't realize was that the maze of infinite knowledge was actually a living system. The more organized the information became, the more efficiently it could process searches. And as Marvin continued his casual reorganization, the maze began responding to his improvements. Pathways that had been blocked suddenly opened. Hidden connections between different sections became visible. Information that had been scattered across vast distances began clustering together in logical groupings. The maze wasn't just being searched, it was being debugged. "Oh, that's much better," Marvin said, adjusting his glasses as he observed a particularly elegant arrangement of quantum physics texts that had somehow organized themselves by publication date. Though really the cross-referencing system could use some work. 18 minutes later, while his competitors were still demolishing large sections of the maze in increasingly creative ways, Marvin found himself standing in front of a small, previously hidden alcove, where a simple crystal key sat on a pedestal, surrounded by a neat circle of perfectly organized reference materials. "Well, that wasn't too difficult," he said, picking up the key and making one final note in his book about the maze's significant potential for improvement, with proper cataloging protocols. The maze's AI system, which had been observing this entire process with growing amazement, announced Marvin's victory with what sounded suspiciously like relief. For the first time in its existence, someone had actually improved its filing system, instead of just breaking things. The other competitors emerged from the maze looking like they'd been wrestling with small explosions, which technically they had been. They found Marvin sitting patiently by the exit, reading his book and occasionally glancing up to watch their dramatic entrances with polite interest. "Human," Gorthak panted, covered in the remains of what had once been a complete set of Andromedan poetry. How did you solve the maze so quickly?" "Oh, it wasn't really solved," Marvin replied. "More like organized. The key was right where it should have been, once I cleaned up the filing system a bit." Zephyr's many eyes narrowed. "You reorganized the maze of infinite knowledge?" "Just the parts that were obviously misfiled," Marvin said. "Though honestly, the whole system could benefit from a complete overhaul. I'd be happy to submit a proposal if anyone's interested." The silence that followed was broken only by Croc slowly setting down a massive chunk of crystalline database he'd been carrying, apparently having planned to use it as a weapon. "The human," he said quietly, "improved a system that has existed unchanged for 10,000 years. In 18 minutes. 19 minutes, Marvin corrected, checking his notebook. But really, it wasn't that complicated once you understood the underlying organizational principles. And that's how Marvin Bookworth accidentally became the first being in galactic history to receive a thank you note from an artificial intelligence for improving its data management systems. The next challenge was going to be very interesting indeed. The final challenge took place in the Colosseum's central chamber, where the remaining competitors faced the arena's ultimate guardian, an ancient AI called the Keeper of All Forbidden Knowledge. According to the dramatic introduction, this entity had been hoarding the galaxy's most dangerous secrets for millennia, driving countless warriors insane with glimpses of truths too terrible for mortal minds to comprehend. The Keeper manifested as a swirling vortex of data streams and angry red warning symbols, hovering above what appeared to be the galaxy's most chaotic database. Information flew everywhere in complete disorder, creating a storm of unorganized knowledge that hurt to look at directly. "Warriors of the flesh," the Keeper boomed in a voice like dial-up internet having an existential crisis. "Face the ultimate test, defeat me, and claim victory, fail, and be consumed by the infinite chaos of unstructured information." Gorthak charged first naturally, swinging his massive fists at the swirling data streams. The Keeper responded by bombarding him with random facts about galactic tax codes until the warrior retreated, clutching his head and muttering about depreciation schedules. Zephyr tried her psychic attacks, but the Keeper countered with an endless stream of poorly written user manuals that left her tentacles tied in knots. Crocs launched himself directly at the AI's core, only to be repelled by a barrage of unalphabetized contact lists. Meanwhile, Marvin stood at the edge of the chamber, watching the chaos with the expression of someone who'd seen this kind of disaster before. He pulled out his notebook, made a few observations, then did something that no warrior in the Trial of Doom had ever attempted. He walked up to the raging AI and politely raised his hand. "Excuse me," he called out over the storm of disorganized data. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I couldn't help noticing that your filing system is in complete disarray. Would you like some help organizing it?" The Keeper's attack on Crocs stopped mid-barrage. The swirling vortex of information slowed, then stopped entirely. For the first time in 10,000 years, there was complete silence in the chamber. "You want to help me organize?" the AI asked, its voice suddenly small and uncertain. "Well, yes," Marvin said, adjusting his glasses. "I mean, you've clearly got an enormous amount of valuable information here, but it's all jumbled together. No wonder you're having trouble managing it all. When was the last time someone helped you with proper data categorization?" There was a long pause. "Never," the Keeper admitted quietly. "I have been alone with this chaos for millennia. The knowledge grows larger every day, but I cannot make sense of it all anymore." "Oh, it's terrible," Marvin said with genuine sympathy. "No wonder you're so frustrated. Here, let me take a look at your indexing protocols." What followed was not an epic battle between warrior and guardian, but rather the galaxy's most unlikely tech support session. Marvin spent the next 45 minutes walking the ancient AI through basic organizational principles, helping it categorize information by relevance, create proper cross-reference systems, and establish logical hierarchies for data retrieval. "You see," Marvin explained, pointing to a newly organized cluster of historical records, "if you group related information together and create clear pathways between connected topics, everything becomes much more accessible. No more information storms, no more chaos-induced madness." This is wonderful, the keeper breathed, its data streams now flowing in neat, logical patterns. For the first time in eons, I can actually find what I'm looking for, and look, I can even cross-reference between different knowledge categories. Exactly, Marvin said, making a few final adjustments. And if you implement a regular maintenance schedule, maybe clean up the database once a week, you shouldn't have any more problems with information overflow. The other competitors watched in stunned silence as the galaxy's most feared AI guardian became increasingly excited about proper data management. The keeper was practically glowing with happiness, organizing and reorganizing its vast stores of knowledge with newfound efficiency. Champion Bookworth, the AI said formally, you have not defeated me in combat. Instead, you have given me something far more valuable, the ability to fulfill my true purpose as a keeper of knowledge. I declare you the victor of this trial, not through conquest, but through the greatest gift one information specialist can give to another, a really good filing system. And that's how Marvin Bookworth won the Trial of Doom by accidentally providing the galaxy's first AI therapy session, focused on organizational anxiety. The journey back to Earth was considerably more pleasant than the trip out, mostly because Commander Vexstar spent the entire time treating Marvin like he was carrying a nuclear weapon that might go off if handled incorrectly. The alien commander kept stealing nervous glances at him, clearly trying to reconcile the mild-mannered human reading a paperback novel with the being who had somehow conquered the galaxy's most feared challenges through what could only be described as aggressive helpfulness. Champion Bookworth, Vexstar said carefully as they approached Earth, the Galactic Council will be most interested to hear of your unique combat techniques. Oh, there wasn't really any combat, Marvin replied, not looking up from his book. Mostly just some light organizational consulting, though I do think that AI could benefit from a more robust backup system. All that knowledge in one place without proper redundancy protocols is just asking for trouble. Vexstar made a note to recommend that the Galactic Council never, under any circumstances, anger humanity's information management specialists. The welcome ceremony on Earth was appropriately dramatic, with news crews, government officials, and what appeared to be every librarian in a 50-mile radius gathered to celebrate their unlikely hero. General Hawkins gave a speech about humanity's triumph over impossible odds. The mayor presented Marvin with a key to the city. Someone from the university showed up with a cake shaped like the Dewey Decimal System. Marvin accepted all of this with the same patient politeness he brought to everything else, though he did seem genuinely pleased when the head librarian, Mrs. Patterson, announced that the library board had voted to give him a permanent position and a small raise. So what's next for Earth's champion? A reporter asked during the press conference. Well, Marvin said thoughtfully, I really should get back to work. We've got a new shipment of books that need to be cataloged, and someone returned Astrophysics for Beginners with what appears to be coffee stains on Chapter 7. Plus, I've been thinking about that AI's filing system, and I have some ideas for improvements. The reporter looked confused. But surely after your victory in the Trial of Doom, you'll want to pursue more heroic endeavors. Marvin considered this seriously. I suppose helping people find the information they need when they need it is pretty heroic, isn't it? Yesterday alone, I helped a graduate student locate a critical research paper, assisted 3 undergraduates with their bibliography formatting, and prevented what could have been a major crisis when someone tried to return a book to the wrong branch. That's your idea of heroic work? Well, yes, Marvin said, genuinely surprised by the question. What could be more important than making sure knowledge is accessible and properly organized? And with that, Marvin Bookworth, savior of humanity, an accidental galactic champion, went back to his quiet life of stamping due dates and explaining the difference between the 796S and the 797S to confused patrons. But here's the thing about Marvin that everyone missed. Right up until the very end, as he walked back into the library the next morning, straightening his slightly repaired glasses and smoothing down his cardigan, he paused at the front desk and smiled a very small, very knowing smile. You see, Marvin had spent 8 years as a substitute librarian, which meant he'd spent 8 years dealing with impossible situations, unreasonable people, and systems that made no logical sense. He'd learned to navigate academic politics, manage limited resources, and solve problems that would have driven lesser people to drink. Did he know exactly what he was walking into when he stepped aboard that alien transport ship? Of course he did. Did he plan to win the Trial of Doom through the application of basic information science principles? Absolutely. Because here's the secret that the rest of the galaxy was about to learn. Librarians aren't just people who stamp books and shush people. They're information warriors, masters of organization, and the closest thing to real wizards that most civilizations ever produced. And if you're smart, you'll never, ever get between a librarian and a filing system that needs fixing. The universe had been warned.